Hello, friends, and welcome back to the porch. If you've lived through more than 55 winters, there's a good chance one name still carries the warmth of childhood evenings and the smell of wood smoke drifting across an open plain. Laura Ingalls Wilder. Her stories, whether read from those familiar yellow-spined books or watched on television after dinner, gave many of us a picture of America that felt simple, moral, and reassuring. A family, a small house, a hard life, yes, but one wrapped in love and certainty. But memory has a way of sanding down the sharp edges. Today, we're going to look beneath that polished surface. Not to tear it down, and certainly not to disrespect it, but to understand what was really happening on the prairie when the wind turned mean and the land stopped forgiving mistakes. Because the truth is, homesteading was not a lifestyle choice. It was a continuous negotiation with hunger, debt, weather, and exhaustion. We all remember Pa Ingalls as portrayed on television, capable, principled, endlessly optimistic. The real man, Charles Ingalls, was those things, and also something else. He had what neighbors once called a wandering foot. Over roughly 20 years, the Ingalls family moved nearly 2,000 miles. That kind of movement wasn't driven by romance or adventure. It was driven by necessity. When crops failed, when debts mounted, when a place simply could not sustain a family, they packed up and left. Laura's childhood was shaped by instability most of us would now consider unbearable. There were grocery bills that couldn't be paid, medical debts that lingered. At one point, Charles Ingalls signed an official declaration stating he was wholly without means just to secure a barrel of flour. The family lived in places that rarely make it into the sentimental retellings: a crowded hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa, and a doorless dugout carved into the banks of Plum Creek. Then came nature itself, indifferent and relentless. In 1875, a massive locust plague stripped fields bare, erasing months of labor in days. This wasn't extraordinary misfortune. It was the baseline reality of frontier life. Wooden frame houses, thin, drafty, and exposed, offered little protection against a climate that could turn predatory without warning. The truth behind the little house is not one of cozy endurance. It is a story of constant adaptation, of learning, often the hard way, that survival on the prairie required more than grit. It required rethinking everything people thought they knew about shelter, warmth, and safety. By the late 1880s, the northern plains had learned a brutal lesson. Winter did not arrive politely. It did not ease people into hardship. It struck like an ambush. Nowhere was this clearer than in Pembina County, a stretch of open land where the horizon offered no shelter and the wind had nothing to slow it down. In January of 1888, the storm that later came to be known as the Killer Blizzard rewrote the rules of survival. The day began almost calmly. Temperatures hovered around 10 degrees above zero, cold, but manageable by frontier standards. Then, in less than 2 hours, the air collapsed. Thermometers plunged to 35 below zero. Winds roared past 70 miles per hour. Snow didn't fall so much as it flew sideways, erasing landmarks, fences, and even the line between earth and sky. For ranchers, the disaster was absolute. Cattle panicked, bolting blindly into the storm. Wooden barns, never designed to hold heat, became wind tunnels of death. In the aftermath, names were counted alongside losses. James Henderson lost 96 head of cattle. Martin Schultz lost all 73 of his. For many, the storm meant instant ruin, years of work, wiped out in a single night. And then there was Friedrich Adler. The morning after the blizzard, Adler opened his barn and found all 68 of his cattle alive. They weren't huddled or frozen. They were standing calmly, chewing hay steam, rising gently from their bodies as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Adler's neighbors were stunned and more than a little embarrassed. His barn had been the subject of ridicule for years. Instead of building above ground like everyone else, Adler had dug down 12 feet into the earth, 40 feet long, 20 feet wide. an underground chamber that many locals openly mocked as foolish, unhealthy, even cruel. They told him cattle needed sunlight and fresh air. They joked that he was digging a grave for his own livelihood. What Adler had actually built was a memory. Growing up in Bavaria, he had known the root cellars Kellers used to store vegetables through harsh winters and scorching summers. He remembered how the earth itself moderated temperature quietly and reliably. He trusted that knowledge more than frontier convention. The physics were simple, even if the insight was rare. Deep soil holds a steady temperature year-round. While the air above plunged into lethal extremes, Adler's underground barn stayed just above 40 degrees. That stable warmth, unheated, silent, and free, was the difference between survival and bankruptcy. What his neighbors called stupid turned out to be genius, not because it was innovative, but because it was ancient. If Friedrich Adler's story sounds improbable, it's only because frontier history tends to hide its quiet engineers. And among them, few stories are as startling or as humbling as that of Sarah Lindstrom. In 1876, the same year the Ingalls family was struggling through another relocation, Sarah's life collapsed in a single command. At 16 years old, she was ordered off her stepfather's claim. There was no inheritance, no safety net, no apology. She was given only the clothes she wore and her mother's Swedish Bible. On the prairie, that was often a death sentence. But Sarah did not beg and she did not flee. Instead, she filed a homestead claim of her own, an act that alone raised eyebrows in the territory, and decided to build shelter in a way that defied local wisdom. With just $27 for materials, she chose not to erect a conventional wooden cabin. Lumber was expensive, drafty, and unforgiving. Sarah understood something many seasoned homesteaders refused to accept: wood-bled heat. So she dug. Neighbors gathered to watch, offering advice laced with skepticism. A local reverend warned her that she would freeze like a potato in the ground. An experienced homesteader named Magnus Thorvaldsen told her she was wasting effort on a hole that would collapse, flood, or suffocate her. Sarah listened politely and kept working. What she built was not a crude pit. It was a carefully engineered habitat. She hired 2 brothers to help her cut and place 247 sod bricks, each 3 feet long, stacked with intention rather than haste. The roof was shaped into a compression arch, distributing weight outward instead of downward, allowing it to support itself without heavy timber. At the entrance, she designed a short trench, an airlock of sorts, to trap dense cold air before it could spill into the living space. Between the inner and outer sod walls, Sarah left a deliberate air gap, creating a thermal buffer that slowed heat loss. The floor was sloped just enough to guide moisture away, preventing rot and dampness. None of this came from textbooks. It came from observation instinct and an intuitive understanding of how Earth behaves under pressure and cold. When the December blizzard arrived, temperatures dropped to 42 below zero. Magnus Thorvaldsen burned through wood at a desperate pace, watching frost creep across his interior walls. Sarah, meanwhile, sat inside her dugout at a steady 64 degrees, splitting kindling in a sweater. What saved her was not strength or luck, it was design. What the stories of Friedrich Adler and Sarah Lindstrom reveal is not just ingenuity, but a different relationship with knowledge itself. Neither of them had formal training in engineering or physics. They did not use equations or blueprints in the modern sense. Yet they understood something fundamental that many of their neighbors overlooked: the land is not passive. It is an active system, constantly exchanging heat, pressure, and moisture. The pioneers who survived the worst winters were not always the strongest or the most stubborn. They were the ones who watched closely. They noticed that cellars stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. They observed that snow, when left undisturbed, acted as insulation rather than a threat. They paid attention to how wind stripped warmth from exposed surfaces and how earth dense and still resisted that loss. At a certain depth, soil holds a nearly constant temperature year-round. This is not folklore, it is physics. Seasonal air temperatures rise and fall dramatically, but the earth below remains steady, slow to change. That stability is what made underground shelters so effective. While wooden houses bled heat through cracks and seams, the ground quietly stored it. The earth functioned as a thermal mass, a heat battery absorbing warmth when it was available and releasing it slowly when conditions turned hostile. This understanding was not new, it was ancient. Humans had been digging into hillsides and plains for shelter long before nail sawmills or balloon frame construction existed. What frontier settlers faced was not a lack of solutions, but a clash between tradition and assumption. Many believed progress meant building upward, visible, and familiar. Digging down felt primitive, even embarrassing. It looked like failure rather than foresight. Yet time proved otherwise. Underground homes required less fuel, less maintenance, and far less labor during the most dangerous months of the year. They did not fight the climate, they worked with it. The earth blocked wind. Snow piled harmlessly on top. Temperature swings softened to manageable shifts. By the 1890s, attitudes began to change. The same neighbors who once mocked Adler's barn started carving their own shelters into hillsides. Dugouts appeared beside farms that had already lost too much to storms and fuel shortages. What had been dismissed as foolish became quietly respected. The lesson here extends beyond architecture. Genuine knowledge does not always arrive with credentials or approval. Often it comes from humility, from admitting that tradition, observation, and patience may hold answers that innovation alone cannot provide. Friedrich and Sarah trusted the earth because they paid attention to it. And in doing so, they found safety where others found only exposure. What makes these stories endure is not just that they happened, but that they left physical traces, places you can still stand in and feel the logic of survival written into wood, soil, and stone. This is not abstract history, it is geography you can touch. If you travel to Walnut Grove, you'll find the Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum, where replicas and preserved sites bring the prairie years back into focus. There is a reconstructed sod house there that surprises most visitors. From the outside, it looks humble, almost temporary. Step inside and the air changes. The temperature steadies, sound softens. You immediately understand why a dugout, for all its appearances, could feel safer than a proud frame house standing exposed to the wind. Nearby lies the site of the Plum Creek dugout where the Ingalls family once lived, with no door, no insulation in the modern sense, and no margin for error. Standing there, it becomes clear that survival was not romantic. It was precise. Every choice carried weight. Farther south in Mansfield, you can visit Rocky Ridge Farm, the final home of Laura and Almanzo. This house tells a quieter story. By then, Laura had lived through enough hardship to value stability over symbolism. The farm reflects lessons learned the hard way. Shelter positioned for protection, not show. Comfort earned through restraint, not excess. Back in Walnut Grove, the old Masters building still stands. It once housed the Masters Hotel, where Laura lived and worked during a difficult stretch of her youth. If you look closely, you can still see the original floor joists, wood Pa Ingalls helped shape with his own hands. They are sturdy but simple, built to last, not to impress. These places matter because they ground the stories. They remind us that the people we talk about were not myths or characters. They were problem solvers responding to immediate pressure, cold hunger, debt, and uncertainty. Walking these sites makes one thing unmistakably clear. The solutions that worked were the ones rooted in reality. The earth did not change. The climate did not soften. What changed was human understanding. The legacy of those stupid ideas, digging down, trusting the soil, respecting thermal mass, is still here, quietly waiting, just beneath the surface. Looking back on these stories from the vantage point of more than 55 winters, a pattern becomes clear. Survival on the frontier was never about bravado or blind optimism. It was about restraint, observation, the willingness to admit when the accepted way of doing things simply didn't work. The pioneers who endured were not the loudest or the most confident. They were the ones who watched carefully and adjusted early. They paid attention to how cold moved, how wind stripped heat, how fuel disappeared faster than expected. And when they realized that fighting nature was exhausting and expensive, they stopped fighting it. They worked with it instead. That lesson feels uncomfortably relevant today. Modern homes are often larger, more complex, and more energy-dependent than ever before. Yet many of us still experience cold rooms in winter, soaring heating bills, and vulnerability when power fails. We build upward, outward, and visible, while ignoring the most stable thermal resource available to us, the ground beneath our feet. Friedrich Adler did not survive the killer blizzard because he was tougher than his neighbors. Sarah Lindstrom did not live through 42 below zero because she worked harder. They survived because they questioned assumptions. They recognized that wood frame structures quick to build and familiar were liabilities in extreme climates. They understood that the earth offered protection without demanding constant fuel in return. This is what makes their stories more than historical curiosities. They are case studies in practical intelligence. Neither Adler nor Sarah rejected progress. They rejected waste. They rejected designs that looked right but performed poorly under pressure. And most importantly, they trusted results over reputation. By the end of the 19th century, their ideas no longer seemed radical. Dugouts, earth-bermed shelters, and partially buried barns spread quietly across cold regions. People who had once laughed now copied. They had learned through loss that visibility and comfort are not the same thing, and that true security is often invisible. The enduring wisdom here is not that everyone should live underground. It is that resilience comes from understanding systems, not appearances. Nature is not an enemy to overpower. It is a structure to be studied, respected, and integrated into daily life. So when you hear an idea dismissed as stupid simply because it breaks from convention, pause before you agree. Remember the man who saved his herd by digging a hole. Remember the 16-year-old who engineered warmth out of dirt and sod. Sometimes the smartest move is not to rise higher, build bigger, or spend more. Sometimes the only way to endure then and now is to have the courage to dig down. Stay warm, stay curious, and I'll see you next time on the porch.